Hey, what's up YouTube? This is the second video of this 3-part series where I explain how I created this realistic looking grass using Blender and Unreal Engine. In the first video, I explained how I use Niagara to build a 2D wind system and dynamically generate a tiling wind texture. I also showed a very simple way to animate grass using that texture and achieve spherical reprojection trick. In today's video, I'm going to dive much deeper. I'm going to showcase a whole bunch of very cool tricks I use to create that natural and very fluffy looking animated grass. Now, a couple of months ago, I released a video explaining a crap ton of industry grade techniques when it comes to rendering grass, some of which I will be reusing in today's video. So you might want to give that video a watch first if you haven't already. Alright, let's get started. Now, I've had an idea that has been bugging me for a while now. You see, this Ghost of Tsushima tech talk was very inspiring to me. I like a lot what they did with their grass. Now, I'd love to be more knowledgeable when it comes to UE and its rendering pipeline to be able to try similar things, using geometry shaders and whatnot, but for now I'm not and I can't. But there's still a lot you can do with that good old world position offset, so I wanted to see how far I could go with it. Hence why the grass mesh I'll be using in today's video looks like this. Now, this will be the subject of a dedicated video, so I'll be brief here, but yes, it's quite bizarre looking, not the typical grass mesh you tend to use. I have these flat cards, right? They are straight, purposely undeformed, and they are all oriented towards the positive x-axis. I used the first UV map to well map my grass textures, nothing fancy. I also used my Databaker Blender add-on to bake these cards pivots in UVs. It's quite a common technique and I made a video on the subject, so feel free to check it out. I also baked the normalized height in UVs in the vertical axis and a random value per card in the horizontal axis, very useful. So that's the mesh I exported to UE, and the idea was to try and see if it was possible to build most of the grass mesh features, bend, orientation and all, using nothing but world position offset tricks. And do that in the hope that I could reach a much more natural look by having a complete control over these features and their randomization. So let's have a look. As usual, my favorite world position offset trick of all times is to reconstruct a world position from scratch and convert it to an offset. So let's do that. 0 subtracted by world position. That collapses all vertices to the world origin because all vertices are now at 0, 0, 0, as simple as that. So let's add the vertices local position, then subtract the baked pivots in local space to center cards on the origin. At that point, scale and rotation can be applied to, well, scale and rotate cards around their pivot points. So I'm first going to use the per instance fade amount node. This 0 to 1 value is based on the instance start and end cull distance settings. That's going to shrink cards at a distance and smooth out the otherwise very harsh instance distance culling. Next, let's apply the instance scale. Here I'm going to assume instances are uniformly scaled and that the scale Z component is used to control that uniform scale. So let's create an up vector, transform it from local to world space, then get that vector's length and set the instance scale along the z-axis. And maybe add an extra parameter to have further control over that scale. Cool, it's working. Next, let's offset cards so they recover their original world position. That's just a matter of adding the baked pivots, transform from local to world space. And here's another neat trick. Instead of offsetting cards using their pivots in world space, I can use the instance position in world space. Cards are going to be centered on that single instance position, not very interesting, but then I can lure between these two positions and control how much cards are spread apart, right? Keep in mind that may mess with occlusion culling, so you might want to increase the mesh bounds a bit, depending on the amount of offset applied on average, just to be on the safe side. Neat. For now, let's set this to 1. So that's a base I can already somewhat work with. Cards are correctly located at their pivot points, scaled based on the instance Z scale, and they all remain straight regardless of the instance rotation, so that's great. But obviously they all face the same direction and are pretty boring looking still. So first I'd like to rotate cards. Applying rotations can be tricky. I'd like to rotate cards around that axis, randomly I suppose, but also possibly tilt cards towards a certain direction. Thus I'd likely need to apply a rotation around the x and y axis as well. And rotations are a bit tricky to stack. It's not impossible, but that's a lot of trigonometry just to orient cards. Fortunately, there's a better and simpler solution. I'm going to construct 3 axes and use a 3x3 matrix to rotate each card. And this method is actually going to help me do crazy cool things, but let's start simple. For now I'm going to assume the z-axis is still the z-world axis. Now I want to rotate cards randomly around that z-axis. How to do that? Well, I just need to tell that mesh that x-axis of yours isn't the world x-axis anymore, but say that one. And your y-axis is now just the cross product between these two. And the 3x3 matrix multiplication will result in vertices matching that new coordinate system. As simple as that. Now I could mathematically generate a random 2D direction to create a unique x-axis per card, but that comes at a cost. A better solution could be to compute that axis ahead of time, and vertex color could be used for this. UVs as well, you could bake a random 2D direction per card in UVs, right? But I used another method, I used the vertex normals. I'll explain this in a minute, but I'm actually going to generate my own normal in world space, so the normal stored in each vertex is kinda irrelevant. Thus, why not make use of that normal to store a random 2D direction for free, right? To do this, I updated my Data Baker Blender add-on. It now can generate a random 2D or 3D direction and bake it in vertex color or normals. Sweet. Side note, I also tried to do this using an action script and geometry scripting, but I hit some kind of roadblock. But still, I'm going to mention it real quick, so let's have a look at that action script. First, it's made to work with static meshes. I get the selected assets, loop through each static mesh, construct a dynamic mesh, then for each LODs, copy that LOD, then I use the split mesh by components function, so that essentially does that. Each card becomes a unique dynamic mesh, right? So then for each card I generate a random 2D direction and store that direction in the vertex normals. Next I append that card to at first an empty dynamic mesh, so that reconstructs the grass mesh card by card, right? And once all cards are processed and merged into that single dynamic mesh, I replace the original static mesh asset with it at that LOD index. And rinse and repeat for all LODs. I also make sure to use a stream when generating that random direction, so all LODs generate the same random direction for a given grass card. Super important. Alright, let's have a look at it in action then. So that's the mesh I'm starting with. Normals are all oriented the same way as expected. Right click and click Generate Random 2D Normal. And voila, see, each card stores a unique 2D direction in the vertex normals. And that direction is consistent across all LODs. Until it is not, because a given LOD may simply delete cards, so that array of components may not be consistent between LODs, and thus there's no easy way to make sure the same normal is shared between cards of different LODs, if that makes sense. Plus, because this approach naively splits components, well, a single grass card may be made of multiple meshes, right? And thus would need to have the same normal. And yet, these meshes won't, because they will be treated as different components. And I didn't find an easy way to automate this. You could manually paint polygroups and split by polygroups, but that's not such a pleasant user experience. So in the end I did that in Blender to make sure LODs share the same data. Alright, back to my world position of such shenanigans then. Now that the vertex normal stores that random 2D direction per card, I can use it as a new x-axis. And again, the remaining y-axis is simply the cross product between these two unit orthogonal vectors. One last step, just make sure to turn on two-sided here and tada, randomly rotated cards. Neat. Now let's say I want to also orient cards according to the landscape. Assuming this setting is set to true, these instances should be oriented to match the landscape normal, right? So a given instance z vector transformed from local to world space gives me the landscape's normal at that instance world position. Just keep in mind that a vector transform applies both the rotation and scale. So here I need to normalize it to get a unit vector, unless that instance isn't scaled in z, but let's be on the safe side and normalize it anyway. So let's use that unit vector as the new z-axis. However, at this point I need to use one more cross product. The reason for this is simple. I now have this slanted up vector, right, and this flat 2D direction. So to build the remaining axis, a single cross product between these two vectors gives me this third vector. And you can see that those three vectors are not orthogonal. So that 3x3 matrix isn't going to result in just a rotation, but is going to deform the mesh in an undesired way. So I first need to do a cross product between these two, that's the first axis, then do a second cross product between that one and the up vector, that's my second axis, and the up vector can be used as is as the third axis. Those three vectors are now orthogonal, cool. Feed them to that 3x3 matrix, make sure to normalize cross products when using non-orthogonal vectors though, and voila. Cards now do indeed match the landscape orientation, great. I can then use a lerp and control if I want straight up or slanted cards, and even exaggerate the effect the landscape has on those cards' orientation, very cool. Let's keep iterating on that up vector though. Because this z vector is normalized and as long as it doesn't equal that vector here, that 3x3 matrix is well defined and stable. So I can shift this z vector in x and y as much as I want to tilt cards more and more. So I could very well use a texture of some kind to shift that up vector in x and y and tilt cards in arbitrary directions and create clumps of grass. Turns out, creating clumps played a key role in the final look. So to create what I call a clump map, I tried different things. I first used Blender to generate a tiling height map, then baked the normals to get the x and y direction, but that was tedious and the result wasn't too convincing. I then tried to artistically paint arbitrary directions using Krita and its neat warp mode, but I still didn't get the result I wanted and it was tedious to paint as well. So next I tried to build a tool in Unreal Engine to generate that clump map for me. It's nothing too complicated, but turns out it worked really well. It's made with an editor utility widget. Here I have a bunch of single property view widgets. Just have to call setObject and use self, and make them point to a variable within this blueprint, and that's it. UE creates a widget for you to tweak that variable, neat. I also made a simple button, nothing fancy, on click event I call this function. Here I do a bunch of safety checks, nothing important, create the render target, get the asset path, draw a bunch of stuff on that render target, and then call this create static texture function, and voila. That tool generates a texture and saves it in the current asset browser directory. So let's have a look at this draw clump function really quick. It's nothing too complex. Here I create a render target, then I create a dynamic instance of what I called a brush material. I then call begin draw to start drawing on that render target on a loop a bit more efficiently. And using a for loop, I draw that brush dozens or hundreds of times. Each time I vary the brush parameters and where it's drawn at. So it's like the tool does a single brush stroke, maybe here, then maybe there, and so on, using an additive process. But it doesn't draw just a simple spherical gradient. Well, almost, but not quite. I compute the 2D position delta between the brush position in UV space and UVs. That delta is then safely normalized to derive a radial direction. UVs are also distorted with a noise node to create something a bit more intricate, something that has a bit more flow to it, right? Then that radial direction is masked using a bilinear sphere mask, and the reason for this bilinear mask is quite simple but important. Again, I'm going to use this clump map, this 2D noise texture, to shift that z vector here, the one used to tilt cards, right? So to create clumps, I want to orient cards toward a single point, and that's what this radial direction is going to do. It's going to shift that z vector toward that point. The thing is, that may result in cards crossing each other at the center point, and that doesn't look too great. Hence the bilinear mask, to fade in the effect, but also to fade it out near the center point and prevent that from happening. Now one more important thing, that brush material is following a principle I explained in the previous video. It's duplicated and offset 3 times to make it tile, and ensure that the clump map itself does tile. So that brush is drawn and randomized a few hundred times, and I end up with that kind of very organic, noisy looking texture, and it works surprisingly well to create clumps, to add a bit of flow to the grass and whatnot. Let's see how it can be applied to the grass shader. I could use the absolute world position to project that texture in world space, right? But that could deform the mesh quite unpleasantly, because 2 vertices at 2 slightly different world positions could sample an ever so slightly different direction from that clump map. So I'd like to get a single quote-unquote clump sample per card. Well, easy enough, use the baked pivots in world space as texture coordinates, and that's it. Then add this x and y offset to that z vector before it's normalized, and voila, cool. But even better, I can randomize the texture coordinates and make that clump map look a bit more chaotic. And here again there are so many ways to do this. Here I'm simply going to offset the world space texture coordinates with that 2D random direction each card stores in the vertex normals. As simple as that. You may also add the pivots in local space, same but different. So 0 offset and the clump texture is sampled as is and is spatially coherent, if that makes sense. And the more offset added, the more random it looks, basically, and it's cheap to compute. Keep in mind that randomizing texture coordinates like that usually comes at a cost, if I'm not mistaken. It's my understanding that this is generally not a very friendly thing to do for your GPU cache, but oh well. Anyway, voila, grass clumps. It adds a bit of chaos to the picture and I kinda like it. Speaking of clumps, it's one thing to influence the tilt, but what about the position? Well, that's precisely what this lerp is for, remember? So I can very well control that lerp with a noisy looking texture of some kind and add even more randomness to the picture. Now here the effect is kinda limited because the clump position is basically the instance position. In an ideal world it would be an arbitrary position and this could be done using a 2D distance field, something to try. At this point, you might think this z-vector could be used to tilt cards away from the wind, and you're absolutely right. Same exact principle, I'm going to use the same setup to sample the wind texture and have the ability to break the spatial coherence a bit and add some randomness to the wind animation. But I'm also going to do something cool. Remember, cards all face the same direction at first, and I rotate them myself with this matrix here. Thus, I simply just know the direction each card is facing. Plus, the value sampled from that wind texture isn't just a scalar value. It's not just how much wind to apply, it's the actual 2D airflow, the wind velocity. So I can safely normalize that wind velocity and get the wind direction, and use that dot product with the direction cards are facing to modulate how much wind to apply. And this might be stupid, but I figured a grass blade is quite a flat piece of geometry, so I suppose it kinda acts as a sail and much less reacts to the wind when it's not facing it. Although realistically it's probably negligible in the grand scheme of things, I'm not sure if that's even something that can be observed. Still, it's quite cheap to implement and it brings some extra randomness to the wind animation, so why not? It's fun to try things. Next I can use the top-down gradient I baked in UVs and a lerp to fade in that offset along the grass length and create some kind of curvature. Alternatively, I can simply multiply each of these two offsets to create individual controls for the curvature, for the clump offset and for the wind offset. Why not? Voila, things are happening, we are making good progress. Now, assuming there's no wind and no clump, the grass still looks quite unnaturally straight and rigid. I'd like to bend those cards and make them have a nice resting pose, right? And again, there are many solutions to do this. You could bake a 2D curvature map, similar to what Epic did for the grass in Fortnite. You could maybe bake a morph target in vertex colors or UVs, but I personally went with a mathematical approach. It uses a sine and a cosine, but it didn't measurably impact performance, so why not? One thing to keep in mind, and I really should do more research on that subject, shaders on GPUs are complicated. Nothing scales linearly, meaning at times you may use a sine and not even pay its cost. Occupancy may be low for any reason, the GPU may be waiting for a texture to be fetched from memory or something, and thus have nothing else to do but math, for free while waiting. As long as it's not dependent on what the GPU is waiting for in the first place, right? Don't quote me on that though, I'm for sure not an expert and it's definitely out of the scope of today's video anyway. So back to my mathematical bend. This HLSL code is pretty much identical to the bend modifier I shared on my Twitter a while ago. It does just that, it bends the mesh around the x-axis, and that's why the grass mesh is exported with cards all facing towards the x-axis. Only once cards are bent do I apply the rotation matrix. Now this HLSL code not only bends the mesh, but also outputs the bend direction, if that makes sense. And that's my starting point to generate a world space normal, but more on that later on. Let's stick to the world position offset for now. So this bend amount is driven by some noise texture to create some variation, right? I also use the wind's x and y magnitude to decrease the bend amount, and that creates a super interesting effect, I think. Grass is naturally curved when standing still, but it straightens the stronger the wind force. Plus, the more wind, the less that other offset participates in the overall z-vector computation, proportionally, right, because of the normalization here. So the grass may be initially tilted to point towards a certain direction because of the landscape or the clump effect, but it will reorient itself to face the wind the stronger the wind blows. Very cool. Alright, we are getting there. Super important thing when it comes to grass is what I call the perceived grass density. Relying on cards is good for performance, but it obviously comes with a downside. Cards are visible until they are not, thus costing vertex processing for no pixel coverage. Using billboards or camera-facing cards obviously solves this issue. Pixel coverage is maximized regardless of the view direction, right? But it's quite an old school technique and billboards can be quite apparent and odd looking. Well, let's try to make the most of this technique anyway. What would be the ideal solution here? I'd want for each grass card to remain curved and bent and randomly rotated, and I'd want to maximize pixel coverage, meaning make each triangle face the camera as much as possible. Alright, let's start simple. Let's get rid of that rotation matrix and the bend HLSL node as well for now. And let's use a matrix to rotate these cards towards the camera. Easy enough, let's transform a z-vector from view towards space and derive an xyz coordinate system from it. Okay, the billboard effect is quite apparent indeed. Let's first get rid of the most jarring part of it, the tilt. So let's get rid of the z component here and normalize the resulting 2D vector. However, that 2D vector can now be null when looking straight up or down, see? If so, the direction to use instead is a y vector converted from view towards space. So do that, if the squared length is close enough to 0, use that y vector instead. Cool, the billboard effect is now only 2-dimensional, that looks a bit better. Then I apply the bend effect. See, that's kinda cool, the mesh kinda rolls on itself to face the camera. Now the wider the grass cards, the more apparent and unappealing this effect is going to look. But here I have quite thin cards for the most part, so it's okay. Hold on, let's press pause for a second. View space means the point of view of whatever renders the geometry. Thus, during the shadow pass, that's from the light's POV. And thus, Y cards face the light during the shadow pass and the camera during the main pass. Not ideal, but to be honest, it's not even that noticeable with plenty of grass around. You may still want to consider using camera space instead. That ensures the vector transform is made from the camera's POV even during the shadow pass. There's no right answer here, both have their pros and cons for the specific effect, gotta pick your poison. On one hand, you have a different but stable shadow when using a view transform. On the other hand, you have a consistent but unstable shadow when using a camera transform. By unstable, I mean shadows kinda disappear when cards are perpendicular to the light's direction and cards flicker a bit at that point as well. Again, that's only something that can be really noticed with individual cards and not that much of an issue with tons of grass blades around, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. You can also, of course, use a shadow pass switch to have further control over what's happening during the shadow pass, maybe disable the camera facing logic entirely or something, up to you. But enough about shadows. Now that cards face the camera, let's rotate them once more. I'm kinda back to square one. Cards are obviously no longer facing the camera because they are made to do so before they are rotated. However, it needs to be done that way because the camera facing logic needs to be applied before the bend effect, else you get something that looks really bizarre. And that bend logic needs to be applied on x-axis aligned meshes, so before cards are rotated. So this is on paper applied in the correct order, but breaks the camera facing logic. Quite a puzzle. So what's the solution? Well, again, the issue is that cards are made to look at the camera before they are rotated. So what if I could take that rotation into account when computing the camera facing matrix? Instead of using the actual 2D view vector, I'm going to use that same vector, but rotated by the inverse of that upcoming card rotation. So that once the card rotation is applied, that view vector is indeed the actual view vector. That sounds complicated, but it's not. If I rotate those cards with a matrix, let's unrotate the view vector with an inverse matrix. And because I work in 2D space here, it can be simplified to just this. So I'm going to unrotate that view vector with the card forward vector used here, and that's it. Voila, this maximizes pixel coverage while still allowing cards to be randomly bent and rotated. Now you might think this looks too weird, and indeed it does a bit, but that's only really because we are looking at a single grass mesh here, and so it becomes quite apparent. But in context, the effect is pretty much invisible, yet it plays a huge role in increasing the perceived grass density. This is without the camera facing effect, and this is with. Without, with. Quite a visible difference in grass density, but same vertex count, and it's not that expensive to compute. Neat. And that's pretty much it for the world position offset. Control the scale, bend, position clamping and orientation clamping with textures to randomize these features, and you can get something that looks quite natural. Speaking of scale, let's add one last thing to this world position offset logic. My stylized grass shader made use of runtime virtual textures to do plenty of cool things. For instance, they were used to match the landscape color, but for realistic grass I don't feel like that's an absolute necessity. Although it's common practice in AAAs to at least give a bit of tint to the grass based on the landscape color. Again, it's up to you. I also used a runtime virtual texture to do a landscape projection, and the same trick could be used here as well, but I decided against it. It doesn't contribute that much visually, and RVTs do come at a cost. Plus, a shader that makes use of RVTs is usually a bit more troublesome to migrate to other projects. It was definitely an issue for people who tried to reuse my stylized grass shader, so this time I decided to not use RVTs. But that made me miss one very cool trick. If you remember, the grass layer I painted onto the landscape was also embedded into an RVT to create some kind of mask and smoothly shrink cards bleeding onto other layers, dirt and whatnot, and to create a smoother and maybe more natural looking transition. And I kinda wanted to do that still for my realistic grass shader. I like a lot what this technique adds to the overall look. But how to do that without RVTs? Well, a good old texture will do just fine. This method isn't scalable and isn't likely to work for a large open world, right? But for most use cases, it's still a viable option. So I built a tool, similar to my scene capture tool I released on my Patreon, but simpler. Basically, it lets you select a landscape and a material, and that material is meant to output the painted layer you want to capture. Click that button and voila, that's my landscape grass layer baked into a texture. It can then be projected in world space in the grass shader using that offset and size, super easy. And obviously that can be used to drive the card scale and smoothly shrink grass bleeding on the dirt layer and do other cool things. That's without and that's with. Without, with. Cool. Normals, oh boy, buckle up. It's one thing to compute an offset for vertices, but fixing normals is usually even more complicated. The more offset shenanigans you do, the more complex that usually is. And at one point I find it easier to just rebuild a world space normal from scratch rather than fixing up an existing one. Plus, remember I encoded a random direction in normals, so I kinda shot myself in the foot here. I'll definitely have better luck rebuilding a world space normal from the ground up. But what kind of world space normal though? Because I feel like there are two schools of thoughts, if I may say so. For stylized rendering, the common method is to have upward normals to unify the way cards and the underlying ground are lit and have something that looks a bit easier on the eye. For realistic rendering, the way to go, at least on paper, is to work with the default vertex normals, if that makes sense, and then rely on a shader to make the light bleed through the geometry and prevent back faces from being incorrectly lit and looking too dark. In UE, you may do this in many ways. You could create your own solution, use subsurface scattering, or best, use the two-sided foliage shading model. Plus, that shader, I believe, automatically sets some variables for lumen to properly work with two-sided cards, but I'm not entirely sure on that, something I read a long time ago. Anyway, there's nothing preventing you from both tweaking normals and using some kind of subsurface scattering, right? And to be honest, I don't think there's one right answer, even for realistic grass. Both methods have their pros and cons. Fortunately, I'll be able to choose between one or the other easily and see which one works best. Alright, let's give it a go. First things first, this is a bit too much to work with, so I'm going to create a much simpler test scene. I'm going to use a single mesh with just 4 cards and 4 directions encoded in normals. Then I'm going to disable the camera facing logic, make sure the material uses world space normals, and disable two-sided here, just to make sure faces are correctly oriented before I go any further. And turns out they are not, so I must have messed up this 3x3 matrix, oopsie. Let's flip this axis and that one. better. Although that likely means I need to flip that right vector here as well, so let's check. Yep, cards are rotating the wrong way now, so let's do that. Okay, fixed. Sorry about that. Next I'm going to switch to the world normal buffer and let's add a sphere while I'm at it, just to have a reference to work with. Okay, I'm first going to get the bent up vector this node outputs. This node works on x-axis aligned meshes if you remember, so the normal is a 3D vector but lies on a 2D plane, right? So choosing between an upward and a forward normal is just a matter of swizzling components. I'm gonna take the absolute value for the z component though. I had a bug and this fixed it, and at this point I'm too tired to ask why. So that's the upward vector and that's the forward vector. So let's use a lerp to select one or the other and let's plug that in the material normal pin. Oh, an error. That's just because this local position here is only available for vertices, not pixels basically, so the pixel shader complains about it. Just have to use a vertex interpolator to fix the issue, which is a good thing actually because I definitely wouldn't want to compute this per pixel. Okay, so working with x-axis aligned cards at first means the normal should face the positive x-axis at first, and that's correct. And as the cards curve, normals gradually shift towards the z direction, as expected. Using an upward normal, same thing except that we start here on the sphere and end up around there. Same arc, but different starting point. So that works, great. Next I need to rotate those normals the exact same way I rotate cards, right? So do the very same transform matrix and done. This card is correct and lerps toward the z vector, this one is good, that one is as well, and that one too. Now let's add some fake wind to tilt cards and make sure it's behaving as expected. And that seems to work. Normals shift toward the right direction, great. Now let's see what happens if I choose a forward normal. That card seems good, normals start here and end up around here with a tilt, so the shift is correct. However, that one doesn't seem to work. And the reason is simple, that normal is aligned with the tilt axis, so that matrix results in no visible changes. Bummer. And this was a huge puzzle, I spent way too much time trying to find an elegant solution. I ended up finding a workaround though. A huge cheat if I'm being honest, but it works. I'm going to lerp the world normal towards the tilt's 2D direction, the greater the tilt, if that makes sense. And that's going to ensure the wind and clump features have an effect on the normals and thus the lighting, regardless of what normal I choose, upward or forward normal, and that regardless of the card's forward axis as well. Quite a mouthful, and I'm not even done. There's one more tricky part, adding a normal map. Normal maps are usually in tangent space, so relative to a 2D surface. And so applying a tangent space normal map when you have nothing but a world space normal can be tricky. Usually I'd use a transform vector to go from one space to the other, but sometimes that doesn't go according to plan. The reason for this is, I think, because tangents are computed based on UVs and vertex normals, and so messing with normals can break tangents, I suppose. It's something I've experienced with my waterfall tool as well when tweaking normals. So here I might have shot myself in the foot by doing shady stuff with the vertex normals, but nothing to worry about. Let's think about it for a second. That normal map is baked in tangent space, meaning relative to this planar surface. And so the z-axis points that way, x-axis that way, and y-axis that way. Well, it's just a matter of swizzling vectors to reorient that xyz system and then rotating the resulting normal according to my reconstructed world normal. Meaning I'm going to say, hey tangent space normal map, that z-axis of yours is now that one, your y-axis is one obtained using a cross product, like so, and your x-axis is the result of this second cross product. Now this could be done a bit more carefully with safe normalization and so on, but oh well, I battle tested it and haven't noticed any issues, and at this point I'm too lazy. And voila, I successfully remapped this tangent space normal to world space according to the card's orientation, bend, and the tilt inherited from the wind and clump effect, on top of having extra artistic controls. Do I want upward or forward normals? One looks better in broad daylight, the other a bit better at sunrise and sunset. Well, can't have both I suppose. Although why not after all? Let's mainly use a forward normal, but slightly shifted towards Z to get the best of both worlds. Oof, quite a puzzle. That normal reconstruction almost got the best of me, but I'm glad I got it working. Moving on. Regarding opacity, first I use desired LODs to have a smoother transition between LODs, because they have to be carefully managed here due to the costly vertex shader. Tree count must be drastically reduced at a distance, and desired LODs are great to make the level of detail transition a bit less apparent. Desired LODs come at a small extra cost though, something to be aware of. Next I use desired masked opacity. Quite uncommon for grass I suppose, but I feel like that helped me get smoother edges and achieve that fluffy look. There's one thing to keep in mind though. That's my grass opacity texture. And mip maps are going to turn that into a mush of gray values, especially in my case, I was probably too aggressive with packing. So at a distance, cards are going to be somewhat transparent because of that desired masked opacity kicking in. There are two solutions, probably more, but I know two. First, you can toy with these options to tweak how mip maps are generated, that may help. Also, UE has this option. I'm not sure what it does under the hood exactly, but it seems to ensure certain values are maintained across the MIP chain. See, there's quite a difference in brightness, and that helps to prevent MIPs from reaching that desired opacity threshold value. Second solution, you can manually tweak MIP maps. Photoshop and even GIMP allows you to do this. Here's the method with GIMP. Just have to have a first layer named like so, duplicate it, reduce its size by half, and name it MIPMAP1. Rinse and repeat until you reach a size of 1 pixel by 1 pixel, and that's the MIP chain. Then export to DDS with the following options. Import it in UE, select Leave existing MIPs in the texture asset, and voila. You can manually customize each MIP, so maybe ensure that desired opacity threshold isn't reached in certain MIPs, and done. That custom MIP workflow can also be used to do plenty of cool things. You could, for instance, embed some kind of fade in or fade out based on distance in MIPs. Say MIP0 is totally black, why not? See, I didn't add any logic to the shader, yet I built some kind of automated fade-in effect. That's just the MIP0 and the desired opacity doing that effect, nothing else. Quite cool. It's also commonly used to reduce specular highlights in the distance, so you could cheat a bit and reduce the value of your specular map and increase the value of your roughness map at a distance. Plenty of cool tricks to do with MIPs, especially in VFX and tech art. You can embed extra data in MIPs and all. Epic did something like this for their win system on Fortnite, super cool. One more opacity trick, you can use a shadow path switch node to do bizarre things. For instance, you could say, hey, cards are entirely transparent when rendered in the shadow path. Or, hey, cards are completely opaque. That's going to increase the shadow coverage quite a bit and make the grass look thicker and more dense. But it's now quite apparent that shadows are casted from the geometry and the geometry alone. So you could choose to do this still, but in the distance. Maybe use a switch that is enabled on the material instance used on distant LODs. That may help to create a denser grass in the distance. That's without and that's with. Keep in mind that now may make the LOD transition a bit more noticeable. Next trick, at a close range, you could say do the opposite. You could use desired temporal AA to fake light bleeding through the grass and casting a weaker shadow. Super simple yet very effective. I was made aware of that trick on Twitter, so shout out to you guys, super cool. That shadow path switch node could also be used in the world position offset logic to do crazy things, like say double the grass card size during the shadow path to increase shadow coverage. I'm not sure why you would do this, but there are plenty of cool things to try. To get a dense enough grass, well, you need quite a lot of grass blades. But it's unlikely you can afford one single grass card or mesh per grass blade. That's probably too much. Got to find some kind of in-between and have cards with more than a few grass blades on them, right? That tends to look quite flat and old school though. But adding some pixel depth offset may help to get rid of that boring flat card look. Here I simply rendered a random value per grass blade. And I simply use that texture to push pixels away in camera space. Super simple, but it creates the illusion of certain grass blades being further away from the camera and gives a bit of depth to the grass cards. Now again, that texture is going to turn into a mush of gray values at a distance with MIP maps, right? And because pixel depth offset creates self-shadowing artifacts with dynamic lighting, it's probably best to ensure that at a distance, that depth value from the texture isn't averaged to a constant value. It's not that big of a deal, but here personally I gradually faded out that depth by fixing MIPs manually. Arguably that's not going to make a noticeable difference, especially considering shadow maps have a limited range anyway, but I thought it was worth mentioning. I'm not sure how it behaves with virtual shadow maps though, something to check. The rest of the shader is super straightforward, so I'm going to breeze through it. First, base color, nothing fancy, I'm just using a simple texture. Roughness and specular, just using 2 textures as well. Opacity mask, already explained, world position offset, same, and normal and pixel depth offset as well. Here I configure the two-sided foliage shader, so it needs a subsurface color. I'm just reusing the base color really, but you could use a texture. And the material opacity controls the transmission amount. 0 is fully translucent. And that's it, so the pixel shader is actually quite simple and cheap. The vertex shader, however, there's quite a lot going on, thus, yes, this grass definitely has a cost. So it's really important to keep the vertex count under control and be quite aggressive with LODs and prevent as much quad overdraw as possible. Still, with a large amount of instances and a somewhat long view distance, performance remains quite decent, I'd say. Please note I'm not using nanite nor virtual shadow maps here. They both are great, but they come with downsides I'm not yet comfortable with. Namely, they don't cope well with world position offset, although it's gotten much better recently. And considering the idea behind this whole project was to see how far I could go with world position offsets, I chose to stick with what I know and what I'm familiar with. And shadow maps and non-nanite meshes are still rock solid anyway. And I feel like I sort of achieved my initial goal. I feel like I managed to recreate most features presented in this tech talk, but at what cost and is it worth it? I personally feel like it's a bit much, especially the normal reconstruction part where it's leaning a bit too much on the hacky, sketchy side of things for my own taste, but I'll let you be the judge of that. It was a fun thing to try and a very good exercise anyway. Voila, that's pretty much it. As promised, a third video is coming up soonish. I'll cover my workflow for creating foliage assets in Blender, and I'm actually working on a Blender add-on to hopefully facilitate this process. I'll also mention a few other things, it should be quite an interesting video. In the meantime, if you want to get your hands on this project, files are available as a tier 3 reward on my Patreon. I also released the landscape layer capture tool and clump map tool I mentioned during the video as tier 1 rewards. That's it, I hope you found the video useful or entertaining, or both, and if you did, feel free to leave a like and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. We're slowly growing, so thanks to you all. Thanks so much for the incredible support on my Patreon as well, I just wouldn't be able to do these projects and videos without you, so mad props to you all. You are definitely noticed and much appreciated. Alright, thanks so much for watching, I'll see you in the next video, take care of yourself, bye bye!